I've had this document sitting in my inbox for about 2 weeks now, and every time I tried to sit down and record it, I found an excuse to do something else because the sheer level of detail in this submission is genuinely unsettling. A listener named Silas sent this over, along with a few blurry photos of what looks like an old-fashioned logbook, and after looking into the location he mentioned, I realized the place actually exists, though it's been scrubbed from most modern maps. It's a long one, so I'd suggest getting comfortable, because the way Silas describes his time at the Osprey Point terminal isn't just a ghost story. It's a look into a type of isolation that I don't think the human mind was ever designed to handle. The first thing I found when I started my 3rd week at Osprey Point was a Polaroid of myself sitting at the main console, dated 3 years ago, wearing a uniform I wouldn't own for another 34 months. I was holding a cup of coffee and looking directly at the camera with an expression of total, exhausted boredom, which is exactly how I felt in that moment. But the timestamp at the bottom of the photo clearly read November 14th, 2019. I didn't even know what Osprey Point was in 2019. Back then, I was still living in Chicago, working a dead-end tech support job, and trying to save a marriage that was already halfway underwater. I didn't move out to the coast until last year, and I didn't take the security job at the terminal until 3 weeks ago. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to find some logical explanation, like maybe it was a guy who just looked a lot like me, but the scar on my left temple from a childhood bike accident was unmistakable. It was me. I was sitting in the same chair in the same room, years before I ever stepped foot in this state. Osprey Point isn't your typical shipping port. It's a massive, semi-automated logistics hub tucked into a jagged stretch of the Pacific Northwest coastline where the fog never seems to fully lift. Most of the heavy lifting is done by these giant, silent automated cranes that move containers from the massive cargo ships onto automated rail cars. There are only supposed to be 2 humans on site at any given time, a technician in the server room and a security guard in the main gatehouse. I was the guard. My job was simple: monitor the feeds, check the seals on the rare manual containers, and make sure the perimeter fence stayed intact. It paid twice what I was making in the city, and the silence was supposed to be a selling point. The supervisor who hired me, a guy named Vance who looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s, told me during the interview that the most important thing was to never leave the gatehouse after 200 a.m., no matter what the sensors reported. I figured it was just some corporate liability stuff about automated machinery being dangerous in the dark. I didn't ask questions. I just needed the paycheck. The first few nights were uneventful, just the low hum of the cranes and the distant crashing of the waves. But then, things started to feel slightly off. I'd walk into the break room to find the kettle still warm, even though the technician, a guy named Elias, was supposed to be in a completely different building a mile away. I'd find my favorite brand of cigarettes in the trash can, which was weird because I'd quit smoking 6 months ago and hadn't told anyone. Then came the boots. I went to my locker one shift and found a pair of heavy, duty work boots sitting there. They were scuffed and worn, perfectly broken in, and when I tried them on, they fit better than any shoes I'd ever owned. Written in Sharpie on the inside of the tongue was my name and my blood type. I assumed maybe it was a standard gear issue I'd forgotten about during the blur of orientation, but when I checked my paperwork later that night, there was no mention of footwear. About a week in, I had my first real conversation with Elias over the comms. His voice was thin and had this weird, hollow quality to it, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Hey Silas, you seeing anything weird on the Yard 4 cameras?" he asked. I cycled through the monitors. Yard 4 was mostly empty, just a few rows of weathered grey containers stacked 3 high. "No, Elias looks dead out there." "Why?" He went silent for a few seconds, and I could hear the sound of him typing rapidly. "The load sensors are triggering," he said. "It says there's an extra 40 tons on grid 12, but the cameras show nothing. I'm going to run a diagnostic." "Don't go out there." I told him I wasn't planning on it. It was 1:45 a.m., and the fog was so thick I couldn't see the fence line. A few minutes later, the gatehouse door opened. It was Vance, the supervisor. I hadn't expected him to be there on a Tuesday night. He didn't say hello. He just walked over to the console, looked at the Polaroid I'd left sitting out, and slid it into his pocket without a word. "You find anything else, Silas?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the monitors. "Just that photo," I said, my heart starting to race. "Vance, who is that in the picture? Why does it look like me?" He finally looked at me, and his expression was completely blank. "Memory is a funny thing in a place like this," he said. "The salt air, the isolation. It messes with the way your brain processes time. Just stick to the schedule. If you see container C409 on the manifest, ignore it. Don't log it. Don't track it." I asked him what was in C409, and he just walked out the door, leaving a trail of damp footprints on the linoleum. The next night, I was bored, and I started digging through the old physical logbooks tucked away in the back of a filing cabinet. Most of them were standard stuff. Gate times, maintenance reports, weather logs. But then I found the book from 2014. I flipped to a random page and stopped. The handwriting was mine. I've always had this very specific way of writing my G's and S's, a sort of jagged cursive that my teachers used to complain about. I read the entry for August 12, 2014. It said, "Fog is heavy tonight. C409 moved to the south dock. Elias says he hears the scratching again." I told him to stay in the server room. "I'm tired of the smell of ozone." I closed the book and shoved it back into the cabinet. I was 24 in 2014. I was living in a studio apartment in Lincoln Park, trying to get a promotion at a retail store. I had never been to this part of the country. I had never met an Elias. I decided to call Benny, the guy I'd replaced. Vance had given me his number in case I had questions about the gate hardware. The phone rang for a long time before a raspy voice picked up. "Who's this?" the voice asked. "It's Silas," I said. "The new guy at Osprey Point." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I could hear a dog barking in the background and the sound of a television. "Silas," Benny whispered. "You're still there?" I told him I'd only been there a few weeks. Benny started breathing heavily, a wet, rattling sound. "Listen to me, kid. If you find the room with the living room furniture, don't sit down. And if the phone rings in the gatehouse, and it's your wife, don't answer it." My wife and I had been divorced for a year, and we weren't on speaking terms. "How do you know about my wife?" I asked, but the line went dead. At exactly 20:15 a.m., the sensors for Yard 4 started screaming. I looked at the monitors, and my breath hitched. There was a container sitting in the middle of the yard that hadn't been there 10 seconds ago. It was bright red, a sharp contrast to the dull greys and blues of the other containers. Painted on the side in white block letters was C409. I checked the automated manifest on my screen. There was no C409 listed. I looked at the camera feed, and the fog seemed to be swirling around the container, almost as if it were being drawn into it. I grabbed the radio. "Elias, are you seeing this? Yard 4, grid 12. There's a red container out there." The radio crackled, but it wasn't Elias's voice. It was a woman's voice. It was soft and familiar, and it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. "Silas, is that you? It's been so long. Why haven't you come home?" It was Claire, my ex-wife. I dropped the radio. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the edge of the desk. The voice came again, this time from the gatehouse phone. The light for line 1 was blinking. I remembered what Benny had said. "Don't answer it." I stared at the phone, the ringing echoing in the small room. It felt like the walls were closing in. I turned back to the monitors, and the red container was gone. In its place stood a man. He was wearing a security uniform, and he was standing perfectly still, looking directly into the camera. He raised a hand and waved. It was me. Not a photo, not a memory. It was me, standing in the middle of Yard 4, 300 yards away. I watched myself on the screen for what felt like an hour, though the clock only moved 2 minutes. The other Silas didn't move, didn't blink. He just stood there, waving slowly, like he was trying to get my attention. I couldn't stay in the gatehouse anymore. The silence was screaming. I grabbed my flashlight and my heavy coat, ignoring Vance's rule about staying inside. I needed to know what was happening. I stepped out into the fog, and the air felt thick and cold, like wet wool. The hum of the terminal was different out here. It wasn't a mechanical sound, but more like a low, rhythmic chanting. I walked toward Yard 4, my flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the mist. The further I got from the gatehouse, the more the ground seemed to shift. The asphalt felt soft, almost like it was vibrating. I reached grid 12, and the red container was there again. The door was slightly ajar. I should have turned around. I should have run back to the gatehouse, grabbed my keys, and driven until I hit a major city. But I felt this overwhelming sense of inevitability, like I was finally arriving at a destination I'd been traveling toward my entire life. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped inside. It wasn't a shipping container. Inside, the walls were paneled in oak. There was a plush rug on the floor, a floor lamp casting a warm yellow glow, and a worn-out leather armchair. It was my living room from my house in Chicago. Everything was there. The coffee table with the ring-shaped stain from a leaky coaster, the bookshelf with the missing copy of The Great Gatsby, the television with the cracked screen. And sitting in the chair was Elias. He wasn't a technician. He was an old man, thin and grey, his skin clinging to his bones like wet paper. He was wearing the same security uniform I was. "Silas," he said, and his voice didn't need a radio anymore. "You're early." "The last one didn't get here until December." I asked him what he meant by the last one. Elias stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. "This place, Silas, it doesn't move cargo. It moves people. But not across the ocean. It moves them through the gaps. You ever wonder why you felt so empty in the city? Why you felt like you were just going through the motions? It's because you were already here. You've always been here." He walked over to a small desk and picked up a logbook. He flipped to the end and pointed to the last entry. It was dated tonight. It said, "Silas arrived at the container. He finally saw the room. The transition is complete." I looked at the handwriting. It was mine, but it was shaky, the writing of an old man. Elias handed me the pen. "It's your turn to be the technician, Silas. Vance needs a new voice for the radio." I told him he was crazy, that I was leaving, but when I turned back to the door, there was no yard. There was no terminal. There was just an endless hallway of containers, thousands of them, stretching out into the fog in every direction. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. But every container I passed was red, and every one of them had C409 painted on the side. I finally stopped when I saw a light in the distance. It was the gatehouse. I burst through the door, desperate for the familiar glow of the monitors. But someone was already there. A man was sitting at the console, his back to me. He was wearing a brand new security uniform. He turned around, and he looked like he'd just seen a ghost. He was younger than me, maybe 24, and he had a scar on his left temple. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How did you get in here?" I looked down at my hands and saw that they were wrinkled and spotted with age. I looked in the reflection of the dark monitor and saw a thin, grey-haired man staring back. I realized I wasn't the security guard anymore. I was Elias. I reached into my pocket and felt a piece of paper. I pulled it out. It was the Polaroid. But it had changed. Now there were two people in the photo. A young Silas sitting at the console, and an old Silas standing in the background, a hand on the younger man's shoulder. The timestamp now read November 14th, 2024. I looked at the young man, the Silas who had just arrived at Osprey Point, and I felt a wave of profound pity. I knew exactly what he was going to find in the logbooks. I knew exactly what he was going to hear on the radio. I sat down in the extra chair in the corner of the gatehouse, the one Vance had told me to never use. The young Silas was staring at the manifest, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Are you the technician?" he asked. I looked at the clock. It was 2:00 a.m. I reached for the radio and pressed the button. My voice came out thin and hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Hey Silas," I said. "You seeing anything weird on the Yard 4 cameras? I've spent what feels like years in that gatehouse now, watching different versions of myself arrive, struggle, and eventually find their way to the container. Vance comes by once a week to bring supplies, but he never speaks. He just looks at the monitors and nods. I've realized that Osprey Point isn't a shipping terminal at all. It's a filtration system. It takes the people who have lost their way, the people who are glitching in the real world, and it pulls them into this loop until there's nothing left of them but a voice on a radio or a signature in a logbook. I'm writing this on the back of the logbook pages, hoping that somehow the signal gets out. that someone reads this and stays away from the coast. But even as I write, I can feel my memories of Chicago fading. I can't remember my ex-wife's last name. I can't remember the color of my first car. All I know is the fog, the hum of the cranes, and the rhythmic thumping of the containers being moved in the dark. If you're ever looking for work and you see an ad for a high-paying security job in a place that doesn't appear on your GPS, do yourself a favor and keep driving. Because once you step into the gatehouse at Osprey Point, you've already been there for years. The man you're replacing isn't a stranger. He's just you, a little further down the line, waiting for his turn to finally step into the red container and disappear for good. I can hear the sensors screaming in Yard 4 again. The new guy, the Silas who arrived tonight, is looking at me for answers. But I don't have any. I just have the radio. And it's time for me to tell him about the red container. There's something about that idea of a loop that really sticks with me, especially the part about finding your own handwriting from years before you were there. I've heard stories about missing time, or people feeling like they're living in a simulation, but Silas's account feels more like a mechanical error in reality itself. It makes you wonder if those moments of déjà vu we all have aren't just tricks of the brain, but actual echoes of a cycle we're stuck in. I'd love to hear if any of you have ever worked a job that felt off, in a way you couldn't explain, or if you've ever found something that shouldn't belong to you, but somehow did. Let me know in the comments, because stories like this make me want to stay far away from the fog for a long, long time. I got an email yesterday from a guy named Elias who just moved back to the city after living in a small town in the Appalachian foothills for 6 months. And he sent along a scan of a document that I honestly can't explain. He was working as a freelance digital archivist, basically a guy who goes into small towns and digitizes their old paper records. And the way he writes about his time in a place called Oak Haven feels like he's still looking over his shoulder every time he hears a floorboard creak. It's one of those stories that start so normally you almost miss the moment things go wrong. But by the time you reach the end, you'll realize why Elias says he hasn't slept through the night since October. I've read a lot of accounts of strange towns, but this one has a specific kind of psychological weight to it that I just couldn't ignore. I found my own funeral program in the back of a library book 3 days after I moved to Oak Haven, and the date of death was listed as July 14th, 1994, which was exactly 2 days after I was born. It wasn't a prank, and it wasn't a coincidence, because the photo on the front was a grainy, black and white version of my own college graduation picture, an image that shouldn't have existed for another 20 years after that program was supposedly printed. I remember standing in the cramped, dust-choked basement of the Oak Haven Historical Society, holding that piece of cardstock and feeling the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees. I'd moved to town because the local council had offered me a 6-month contract to digitize their colonial-era records for a decent sum of money. And since I'd just lost my job in Philly and needed a place to clear my head, a quiet town in the middle of nowhere seemed like a dream. Oak Haven was beautiful in that classic, postcard sort of way. Cobblestone streets, ancient oaks that arched over the roads like cathedral ribs, and people who waved at you from their porches like they'd known you your whole life. My first morning there, I walked into the local diner, a place called the Copper Kettle, and the bell above the door hadn't even finished ringing before the waitress, a woman named Martha who looked to be in her 60s, set a mug of black coffee down at a booth. "Morning, Elias," she said with a smile that was just a little too wide. "2 eggs over easy and sourdough toast, right?" I froze, my hand still on the door handle. I hadn't told her my name, and I'd never been to this town in my life, let alone shared my very specific breakfast order with anyone here. I guess I must have looked confused, because she just chuckled and wiped her hands on her apron. "You got that look your father used to have when he was hungry," she added. I sat down, my heart doing a weird little rhythm in my chest. "Martha, my father never lived in this state," I said as calmly as I could. "He grew up in Oregon and died in a car accident in Portland when I was 5. Martha's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went very still, like stones underwater. "That's a real shame," she replied. then turned and walked back to the kitchen without another word. I tried to shake it off as some weird small town quirk, the kind of place where everyone is related, and they just project old memories onto new faces. But the feeling of being recognized followed me everywhere. I'd walk down the street and see people stop their conversations to watch me pass, their expressions not hostile, but expectant. Like they were waiting for me to do something I'd forgotten I was supposed to do. My job was located in the basement of the old town hall, a stone building that smelled of damp limestone and rot. The head of the historical society was a man named Arthur Gable, a dignified, silver-haired gentleman who wore three-piece suits even in the summer heat. He was incredibly welcoming, showing me the stacks of ledgers and birth certificates I'd be scanning. "It's important work, Elias," he told me as he led me to my desk. "We have a saying here in Oak Haven. Nothing is ever truly lost, it just waits to be found again." By the end of the first week, the subtle inconsistencies started to pile up. I was sorting through a box of town council minutes from the 1950s when I found a group photograph of the founding members of the Oak Haven Library. Standing in the back row was a man who was the spitting image of me. Same height, same jawline, same cowlick in his hair. But the caption on the back identified him as Elias Thorne, the town's first archivist, who had passed away in a fire in 1958. I stared at the photo until my eyes burned. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was a mirror. I decided to bring it up to Arthur that afternoon. I walked into his office, the photo in my hand, but he was on the phone. I stood by the door, and as I waited, I realized the room had gone silent. Arthur wasn't speaking into the receiver, he was just holding it to his ear listening. Then, he looked up and saw me, and he didn't look surprised. He just hung up the phone and held out his hand for the photo. "Ah, the first Elias," he said softly. He was a dedicated man. "You have the same hands as him. You know, strong, steady. It's why we were so glad you accepted the position." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just stood up and ushered me toward the door, telling me I should get some rest, and that the Sunday silence was starting soon. That was another thing, the Sunday silence. From 200 p.m. to 400 p.m. every Sunday, the entire town just stopped. No cars on the road, no one in the streets, no music, no noise. I'd asked my neighbor, a friendly enough guy named Miller, about it once, and he just shrugged and said it was a tradition to honor the peace of the valley. But that Sunday I stayed awake and watched from my window. The Millers, who were usually loud and active, just sat on their porch, perfectly still. They weren't reading, they weren't talking, they weren't even looking at anything. They were just staring straight ahead, their eyes glazed over for 2 hours straight. They didn't even swat at the flies that landed on their faces. It was like the whole town had been switched off. The dread really set in during my second month. I'd started to feel like I was losing time. I'd wake up in my cottage with dirt under my fingernails and the smell of pine needles in my hair, but no memory of leaving the house. I found a pair of heavy work boots in my closet that I'd never bought, scuffed and caked with a reddish clay that didn't match the soil in my yard. When I went to the Copper Kettle for lunch, Martha would say things like, "You were out late last night, Elias. Hope you found what you were looking for at the creek." I'd just nod and smile, too terrified to admit I had no idea what she was talking about. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail of my day, trying to anchor myself to a reality that felt like it was dissolving. But when I'd check the journal in the morning, I'd find pages ripped out, or sentences rewritten in a handwriting that looked like mine, but felt wrong. Too controlled, too archaic. One night I couldn't sleep, and I decided to go back to the archives. I had a key Arthur had given me, and I felt like the answers were buried in those boxes of paper. The town hall was pitch black, and the air was so thick with the smell of old paper it felt like I was breathing in the past. I went down to the basement, but instead of going to my desk, I followed a narrow hallway I'd never noticed before. It led to a heavy oak door with a brass plate that read E Alamati Ione. Inside, there were no ledgers or maps. The walls were lined with thousands of small wooden boxes, each labeled with a name and a year. I walked along the rows until I found a section labeled 1990 to 2000. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. I found it, a box labeled ELISVNC 1994. I opened it, expecting to find evidence of some sick prank. Instead, I found a collection of items from my childhood. My favorite stuffed bear with the missing eye. My kindergarten report card. The watch my mother had given me for my 18th birthday. The one I'd lost at a music festival 3 years ago. At the bottom of the box was a stack of cassette tapes. I grabbed a portable player from my desk and hit play on the first one. It was a recording of a therapy session. I recognized the voice immediately. It was me, but I sounded younger, maybe 20. I was talking about Oakhaven. I was describing the Oaks, the diner, the copper kettle. But in the recording, I was saying I couldn't wait to get back home. I was talking about how the city felt fake, and how Oakhaven was the only place that was real. I've never been here before, I whispered to the empty room. I've never lived here. Then, the tape changed. The voice wasn't mine anymore. It was Arthur Gable. Elias is resisting the integration, he said, his voice cold and clinical. He still believes in the Portland narrative. We may need to increase the exposure to the archives. The memory of the car accident is holding firm, but we've successfully planted the funeral program. He'll find it soon. He needs to understand that he didn't come here for a job. He came back because he ran out of time. I dropped the tape player, and the sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. I realized then that every person I'd met in this town was in on it. The Miller's Martha, the mechanic who'd told me my car needed a new alternator, and that it would take weeks to get the part. They were all part of a massive, coordinated effort to rewrite my life. I ran for the stairs, but the basement door was locked. I started pounding on the wood, screaming for help, until the small window in the door was filled by a face. It was Mrs. Miller. She didn't look angry. She looked concerned, like a mother watching a child have a nightmare. "Oh, Elias," she said through the glass. "You're always so dramatic during the first cycle. Just sit down and breathe. The Sunday silence is coming early this week. You'll feel much better once the static clears." I backed away from the door, my flashlight beam shaking. I found a small ventilation window near the ceiling and managed to kick it open, squeezing through and falling into the damp grass outside. I didn't go back to the cottage. I ran toward the woods, thinking I could hike out to the main highway. But Oakhaven doesn't work like that. The woods felt like they were looping. I'd walk for hours, following the North Star, only to find myself standing back at the edge of the town square, looking at the stone facade of the town hall. The oaks seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their branches tangling together to block the paths. I spent 3 days in those woods, cold and starving, until I finally collapsed near a creek. When I woke up, I was in a bed. Not my bed in the cottage, but a room I didn't recognize. It was furnished in the style of the 1950s, heavy mahogany dresser, a rotary phone on the nightstand, lace curtains. Arthur Gable was sitting in a chair by the window, reading a book. "Welcome back, Elias," he said without looking up. "You gave us quite a scare. The creek is dangerous this time of year." I tried to get up, but my body felt heavy, like it was made of lead. "Arthur, what is this place?" I croaked. He set the book down and walked over to the bed. He leaned in close, and I could smell peppermint and old parchment. "This is Oakhaven, Elias. It's a repository. We don't just keep records here, we keep people. The world out there, the cities, the noise, the forgetting. It's too much for some. You died in 1994, Elias. You died in Portland, and you died in 1958, and you'll die again in 20 years. But Oakhaven is where you wait between the scripts. You were starting to forget your role, so we brought you back to the archives to remind you." He handed me a glass of water, and I was too weak to refuse it. As I drank, the memories started to shift. I remembered the car accident in Portland, but it felt thin, like a movie I'd seen a long time ago. I started to remember the fire in 1958. I could feel the heat on my face and hear the roar of the burning ledgers. I remembered Martha when she was a young girl, and I remembered planting the oaks in the town square. It's not that I was being brainwashed. It was worse. It felt like a doorway in my mind had been kicked open, and a flood of lives I hadn't lived was pouring in, drowning the person I thought I was. I fought it for as long as I could, gripping the edge of the mattress and whispering my real name, my social security number, the name of my high school. But Arthur just watched me with that patient, terrifying smile. Eventually, the resistance broke. The static cleared, just like Mrs. Miller said it would. I stopped being Elias Vance from Philadelphia, and I became Elias the archivist of Oak Haven. I spent another 4 months there, finishing the digitization project. But I wasn't just scanning papers, I was rewriting them. I was fixing the inconsistencies, making sure the records matched the reality we were building. I saw the Millers every day, and we'd talk about the weather and the oaks. I'd eat at the copper kettle, and Martha would tell me I was looking much better. I even participated in the Sunday silence, and I finally understood the piece they were talking about. It's not that you're staring at nothing. It's that you're letting the town speak to you. You're letting the history fill the empty spaces in your head. The only reason I'm out now is because of a mistake. Arthur had me digitizing the Recambio boxes, and I found a box that shouldn't have been there. It was labeled RTHER Gabrielli 1922. Inside was a diary. In it, Arthur wrote about how he'd found Oak Haven when it was just an abandoned ghost town. He'd been a doctor, a man who couldn't stand the thought of death, and he'd figured out a way to use the town's unique geographical isolation and a series of psychological triggers to create a closed loop. He wasn't some eternal guardian. He was a man who had trapped himself in a dream and had been kidnapping people for decades to play the parts in his play. He would find people who were grieving, people who were lost, and he'd bring them here, slowly replacing their memories with the town's history until they couldn't leave. That spark of the old Elias, the one who hated being told what to do, flared up one last time. I realized that if Arthur could be found, so could I. I waited for the Sunday silence, but instead of sitting still, I used the 2 hours of absolute stillness to walk out of town. I didn't follow the woods, I followed the creek, just like Martha had mentioned that first week. I figured the water had to lead somewhere that didn't loop. I walked through the freezing water for miles, my legs going numb, until the smell of pine was replaced by the smell of diesel and exhaust. I hit a logging road, flagged down a truck, and didn't look back. I'm in a motel in Ohio now. I've changed my name, I've dyed my hair, and I never stay in one place for more than a week. But here's the thing that keeps me awake. The reason I sent this to you. Yesterday, I went to a small library to use their computer. I was looking for Oak Haven on Google Maps. But just like before, the town doesn't exist. There's just a blank green space in the foothills where it should be. But as I was leaving, the librarian, a young woman I'd never seen before, stopped me. She had a kind, wide smile, and she held out a book I'd left on the table. "You forgot this, Elias," she said. I looked down, and my blood turned to ice. It was a colonial-era ledger from the Oak Haven Historical Society. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't even seen it since I left. I took the book, my hands shaking, and when I got back to my motel, I opened it. On the very last page, in fresh ink and in my own handwriting, it says, "The archives are incomplete without you. See you on Sunday." I don't think I actually escaped. I think the creek was just another part of the script. I think Oak Haven is just waiting for me to get tired of running so it can reset the loop. Every time I look in the mirror, I see the man from the 1950s photo a little more clearly, and I catch myself humming the tune that Martha used to whistle at the diner. I'm terrified that one morning I'm going to wake up, and the motel room will be gone, and I'll be back in the cottage, and Mrs. Miller will be standing on her porch with a pie, telling me I look like I've had a long night. The most disturbing part of Elias's email isn't even the book showing up at the library. It's a small detail he mentioned at the very end, almost as an afterthought. He said he finally looked at his own birth certificate, the real one he'd kept in his wallet his whole life. He said the paper felt different, thicker, older. When he held it up to the light, he saw a watermark he'd never noticed before. It wasn't the seal of the state of Oregon. It was a tiny, intricate oak tree with the words Oak Haven Reclamation etched into the fiber of the paper. It makes you wonder if any of us really know where we're from, or if we're all just playing parts in a town we haven't found yet. If you've ever been to a place that felt a little too welcoming, or if you've ever met someone who seemed to know you better than they should, maybe take a closer look at your own history before it decides to rewrite itself. Let me know what you think in the comments, and stay safe out there.